let's begin. Our presenter tonight is Michael J. Thorp. He's an author, broadcaster, media consultant. He is a veteran of radio and television and has done everything from serving as news anchor for ABC television to hosting an Emmy Award-winning radio program and much more. He's authored, my note says 4 books, but I think he's up to 5 now, including The Legend of the Abominable Huckleberry, 2 Great Lakes Trivia Test books, and Michigan's Thumb Drive, which of course he'll be talking about tonight. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming. I'll turn this over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here. And the only thing it's disappointing is I can't see you all. This is a whole new world that we're all living in, and we're all learning to deal with this. So here we go, and I'm going to try to tell you some great stories. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Phil did tell you a couple things, but I will tell you that I've worked at radio stations from Detroit up through Saginaw and north. I've won Emmys. I've been on television technically all over the world. I don't have to go there. They just send the tape. And I started in radio when I was 18 years old out of high school because I always wanted to be a disc jockey, and I got to be one. I was a DJ. I played rock and roll. I played country music. I played classical music, believe it or not. I was a talk show host and a television news anchor for ABC, as well as working as the voice of WNEM TV5. So my background is way in broadcast, but I started writing the books because I used to collect information for being on the air, talk about Michigan history and that kind of thing. And I had this box. It's a really cool box where every time I came home from a meeting or a program that I hosted, or I found a brochure that was interesting, I tossed that information in that box. Well, I kept doing that for a couple of years, and I used it, but I just kept it because I figured I was going to someday do something with it. Well, we got ready to move, and my wife, Ginny, said, "What are you going to do with that box?" So I thought, well, I'm going to take it. And she said, gave me one of those looks that told me she didn't want me to take it. So I took it, and I wrote a book. I got rid of the box, and I wrote a book. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But let me start with the story about Michigan's Thumb Drive and Michigan history, which has fascinated me since I was a kid. History, and I do have a degree in history from the University of Michigan. It's my avocation, not necessarily my vocation. But history is stories with dates. You can't make up better stories than those things that really happened. And every town has a story. And the story is kind of a roadmap to what that community is today. And I'll find some pretty interesting connections as well. So I'm going to tell some stories. I'm going to draw some connections, and we're just going to have some fun, hopefully learning a few things that you don't know. Now, I start by saying, you know, Stephen King couldn't make up anything stranger than what has happened in real life. And all I have to say is one word to prove it: Titanic. Can you imagine a movie producer somewhere coming up with this great idea of a film about the world's largest ship? It's the most expensive ship in the world. It's claimed to be unsinkable, and it has the richest, most important people in the world going across on its maiden voyage. Do you think that a movie producer that's going to put money behind something is going to say, that's a believable story? Well, it's just not. We all know it's not believable, but it happened. So that gives you an idea of some of the things that really happened, which is why I stick with history. I'm always interested in that. The book we're talking about tonight is, of course, Michigan's Thumb Drive, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But my first book was the Great Lakes Trivia Test. That's the book where all of the information got put in. So, you know, and I got rid of the box. Well, actually, I saved the box, and I keep on using it, but every year I have to empty it out for, you know, obvious purposes. So some of the questions, to keep it out of my wife's sight, really. So the question, you know, what I do is I wrap up these little stories wrapped in a trivia question. So here's one for you. A peninsula is a bit of land surrounded by waters on 3 sides, right? It's a body of land projecting out into the waters. So how many peninsulas are there in Michigan? Well, you know, is it A, 2? And maybe I'd love you to answer in your chat, just for the fun of it. If you think that there are 2, write in your chat A. If you think that there are 5, B, or if you think there are at least 7, put C. I'm just kind of curious about what we're going to see here. So let's see if I can see what you wrote here. I got only one answer, and that answer is, Deborah, you're right. You're right. There it is right there. These are just the ones that I came up with so far. There's, of course, we all live in a peninsula if you live in Michigan. Lower and Upper Peninsula. And the Thumb, of course, is a peninsula. There's the Garden Peninsula, the Leelanau Peninsula, the Mission Peninsula, the Keweenaw Peninsula. And I'm sure there are more that I'm forgetting right now. And if you think of one, put that in the chat too, so I'll be sure I can add that in the future. There we go. My next book was actually part of a television program that I worked on with PBS, The American Civil War Years, and I hosted this. It won an Emmy as well. And we built this book. When we went to Civil War reenactments, and I pretended to be an embedded reporter, just like they were sending at the time overseas. And so I would stand there and I'd interview these Civil War soldiers. And these people that are reenactors, they wear the same clothes. They wear the same, use the same equipment. They camp out in the tents. It's wool. It can be pretty miserable in the hot sun. And one of my favorite stories is I was standing there and I'm looking at a camera, looking straight on at a camera and talking, and I heard this thunder coming up behind me. And pretty soon the cavalry came and passed me on each side, kind of making me in between there. It looked really cool on camera, but it scared the crap out of me in real life. They used it because they thought it was pretty funny. But that's part of this whole Michigan Civil War years, the Michigan experience. And among the stories that we have in this book are a few about Michigan as well. For instance, let's talk about General George Armstrong Custer. You've all heard of Custer. You probably don't know, or maybe you do, that he's from Monroe, Michigan, actually born in New Rumley, Ohio, but ended up in Monroe, Michigan, where he grew up. And there's a great story about Custer, who they called Army, by the way. Nobody called him George. They called him Army. He was dating this girl in Monroe. And her father, who was a businessman, didn't much like it. I'm a dad of daughters. I get that. And you might understand that as well. So he was scheming for a way to get him out of town. Guess what he did? He wrote a letter to his local congressman, who he had supported for many years, and asked him to send him to West Point. And Army Custer went to West Point, got him out from under the daughter's feet. It didn't work. She came back. He came back later, and they ended up getting married. But let's talk about Custer for a minute. Custer, last in his class when he got through at West Point. Last. He was the first in his class to be a general. He was 23 years old when he became a general. And he was crazy. I mean, he was looking for glory like many young men were at that time. Well, that'll be a constant as we talk this evening. And basically, his looking for glory led to his death at the Little Bighorn. Custer is just an amazing character, very fascinating. His brother was with him. His brother Tom was with him at the Little Bighorn as well. And his brother Tom was awarded 2 medals of honor in 1 month. Talk about crazy. And you know what they were doing was an old-fashioned version of what we sometimes call capture the flag. You know, we play the game these days. When I was a kid in Boy Scouts, we played capture the flag. But what he did was he captured the enemy's flag twice in a month. And that was so glorious that they gave him medals of honor. And that's also one of the reasons why after the war, and some years later, they started taking back some of these medals of honor, thought they had been overprescribed. By the way, you can see those flags. Many of them are still at the Michigan History Museum in Lansing, and they're being restored there. There's another story that we got about a Michigan kid. And I say kid because this was a 16-year-old drummer boy from Owasso, who also won a Medal of Honor in 1862 when he was, and he also captured the flag. My next book is a children's book. It's called The Legend of the Abominable Huckleberry, and it has to do with Crossroads Village and Huckleberry Railroad here in Genesee County. And the story is that the Huckleberry Railroad got its name because people would get off the train because it could move so slow, and pick their huckleberries and get back on the train. And this was a train that was built by Lewis Cass to get lumber from up in the Thumb all the way up to Port Austin. So it was used quite a lot. And the next book I did was the Even Greater Great Lakes Trivia Test. So there we go. Now let's take our trip around the Thumb, okay? What I did, it actually started with a friend of mine named John Schmidt, who owns a travel agency. And he called me one day, this is some years ago, and he said, hey, would you like to lead a tour, a bus tour around the Thumb and talk to people about the history? Well, he's going to give me somebody to talk to about history. I think, yeah, I'm going to do that. So I traveled with them. But I decided what I needed to do before I went is to take this little trip. So I took the trip whoops, I messed that up, starting in Bay City. Actually, I started in Frankenmuth and went all the way around M25, as you can see, all the way down to Bay City and then back across. So that was the trip that I did that day. And that's the beginning of this story. Because as I rode along, I kept on jotting down notes about, for instance, you see there's Bay City, excuse me, and then there's Wisner and Unionville and Seaboing, some fascinating places. Wisner, by the way, was named for Governor Wisner, who happened to have been, he never was there, but he was governor at the time that they were looking for names, once again, for these cities. So it became Wisner. His son, I'll tell you first about Governor Wisner. His name was Charles Wisner, and he was a Lapeer County prosecutor before he became a congressman, and then he became governor of Michigan. He quit and went off to the Civil War, where he created his own battalion and went, but he died on his way. He never fought in the Civil War. He was one of the people that died of disease. His son, Chip, lived here in Flint, and I, by the way, am in Flint as we speak. And he was the first person to build a horseless carriage in the Auto City. Here we are in Flint, where we built Buicks and Chevrolets for over 100 years, but he built the first one. And Chip Wisner was famous for doing that. It was loud. It was very loud, and it scared horses, so nobody liked him having this thing. But the one thing that people remember about his car was that it had no brakes. The way he stopped it was by running it into his garage, hopefully slow enough so he didn't blow out the whole back end, and kind of running into the back of the garage, of the wall back there. And actually today at Crossroads Village, which is a historic village here of historic buildings that have been gathered from all over the county and beyond, his carriage house is there. They fixed the back wall, by the way. So just tell you a little bit about Wisner. But one of the things that we do, excuse me, is we start with the names. Let's see if I can. At this time, the map was growing exponentially. And communities were being created all over the place. They had to have a name for these places, and it is not as easy as it sounds. And they came up with names, people that lived there, they named them after their friends and their relatives and their wives, the first postmaster, the first people that lived there, business associates, heroes. They came up with all kinds of things that they did that. And let's see if I want to do that. Oh, I'm ahead of myself here, so we're going to leave it right there for a second. Now, when I started my trip around the Thumb, I started in Frankenmuth because, as I always tell people, I like Frankenmuth. And it was fun to start there. But, one of the things you might not know about Frankenmuth is that it's part of several communities up there in the Thumb that were founded by German Lutherans who came to Michigan in the 1850s. Their goal was to teach the Indians, teach the Native Americans about of course, they wanted to convert them to being Lutherans, and they wanted to teach them how to write and how to read. And that was their purpose. That was why they came. And they came If they from to Frankenmuth, which is the place most of us are familiar with now. And of course, Muth means courage in German. So it was the courage of the Franks. And they were also from the Franken segment of Germany when they came here. But there was also Frankentrost, which is comfort, Frankenlust, which not surprisingly is pleasure, and Frankenhilf, which later became Richville. The reason it became Richville is kind of an interesting story. They had a train that went through Richville, and, or I should say Frankenhilf, and that's how they would have said it, the Germans, Frankenhilf. And the conductors on the trains couldn't say Frankenhilf, so they called it Richville because the land was so beautiful all over the place there. So that's kind of how that came to be. In the mid to late 1800s, they were coming up with all kinds of names for people, for local communities. So some of them were kind of drawn from a distance, and we'll talk about that in a second. For instance, you ever heard of Emmett County? Did you know Emmett County was named for a trader who was hung by his country? It was Robert Emmett. He was an Irish patriot, and the English strung him up for his actions for Ireland. And there were a lot of Irish people that lived in the Emmett area. And guess what? They named it for Emmett, kind of a thumb in the eye of the English every time they can. So here's another one. Tuscola. There was a lot of Indian names they used, and Tuscola is one, right? No. Tuscola is not an Indian name. It was a name that was just made up by Henry Schoolcraft. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Henry Schoolcraft. There's Schoolcraft County. He did get his name in the county. Schoolcraft College. He was he was integral to Michigan's history. But he came up with some other names that he just made up as well, like Alcona, Ascota, Alpena, Kalkaska, Iasco. There were so many. He made them up. He thought they sounded a little Indian and a little Latin. And so that's what he did. He made up these names. And we'll hear more about Henry Schoolcraft and his making up names in just a couple minutes. He was born in 1793 in New York. He died in 1864, right towards the end of the Civil War in Washington, D.C. He's interesting for a lot of reasons. Henry Schoolcraft wrote about the native people that he met on his journeys. He took a trip to Mississippi, which at that time was not easy, excuse me, looking for minerals. And he was in Missouri and Arkansas, and he found the largest lead mines in the country in Missouri, and they're still being mined today. In 1820, Governor Lewis Cass asked him to join him as a topographer on his mission to the upper Mississippi River and Lake Superior, as they were in a search for the source of the Mississippi River. He didn't quite make it all the way because of the weather. They weren't sure. They thought they might have got it. And Henry Schoolcraft named the final lake that they were at that time Cassina, another one that he just made up, but he used the governor's name in that one. Later, Henry Schoolcraft was appointed an Indian agent, the first in Michigan at Lake Superior. In 1832, once again, he's on the road in the Superior region looking for the source of the Mississippi River. And this time he found it. And it's in Minnesota. And the place that he found it was also a lake, a pond, and he called it Lake Itasca, another name that he just made up. He just made up. He was a geologist, the state's first Indian agent. He made them all up these names because he needed names, and he just thought they sounded cool. And they are called neologisms. I know it takes me 2 or 3 runs to try to get that word just right. So basically, the names, they sounded like Indian names, and that's why he named them that. He's fascinating because when he gets up to the Superior country, up the Sault Ste. Marie, St. Ignace, up in that area, he meets a young Native woman named Jane Johnston, whose father happened to be a chief of the tribe up there, of the Chippewa. So she had many stories that she heard from her grandfather. And with the help of Mr. Schoolcraft, she wrote them all down. And she was the first Native American woman to publish a book in the world. Kind of a fascinating story, but the story doesn't end there, because you've read her stories. Whether you think you have or not, you know the stories, because there was a guy who also read her stories and decided he was going to write a poem about it. His name was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And his story from Jane Schoolcraft's story was called The Song of Hiawatha. You might remember that. By the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the shiny big sea water, stood the wigwam of Nokomis, daughter of the moon Nokomis. Dark behind it rose the forest, rose the black and gloomy pine trees, rose the firs with cones upon them. Bright before it beat the water, beat the clear and sunny water, beat the shiny big sea water. It was an epic poem that took all of the stories that Jane Schoolcraft had remembered and had written down and turned them into an epic poem. So there's kind of another fascinating story here. To talk about the thumb, you can't miss the great fires of 1871 and 1881. They happened exactly 10 years apart, almost exactly. And it was in the summer of 1871, it was hot and dry. And by this time, much of the lumber had been taken because, you know, the lumbermen bought all the land and then they cleared it. But they didn't need all of the trees. Today, when a lumber company takes lumber, they take every part of the tree and they use everything. And then they replant the tree because that makes it sustainable, right? Well, back then, they didn't need the branches and all that stuff. So what they did was they would cut the trees down, take the valuable part, and leave everything else land. They would have 15 to 18 feet of refuse, of dry, tinder dry kindling all over up there. That's certainly a problem. And of course, now they had all this land and no need for it anymore. They weren't going to be farmers, so they started selling it. And it was, they were selling at what? At 40, 80, and 160 acre parcels, which is, you know, a cool thing for people that have been trying for their whole lives to get a hold of some land. The problem was this was a huge forest and a deep and dark forest. It had been forever. So the slashings, these leftovers, were 12 to 15 feet high plus. But these farmers and their families that bought this land, they had to figure out a way to remove not only the slashings, but stumps that could be 8 feet plus in diameter. That's a huge feat of strength. And if you got to think about it, back then, you know, they had to dig them out. And most of these guys were farmers that had maybe a couple, 3 sons and some friends. So it wasn't very many of them. So there had to be an easier way. And there was. And we still do it today. They burned it. They tried burning it. And it worked for a long time. But a big wind came up in 1871 and just blew across the whole of the thumb. And actually more than that. We'll talk about that in just a second. The fires moved very, very fast. On September 1st, a fire reached Sandusky. It burned a school and a house. It exploded in the Black River all the way down. It hit Deckerville. It reached Carsonville in the thumb. It was burning fields on Mackinac Road 2 miles from Saginaw. The whole of the thumb was involved in this. Children in Cass City went to school that morning, but they had to be dismissed because the smoke was so thick that they couldn't breathe. The fire had been smoldering for days, according to Sergeant Bailey, who was with the U.S. Signal Service. But then the strong winds rose, and the hundreds of small fires that had been burning for weeks all around the area suddenly exploded into this huge fire. What they said, everything except for one building burned in the Cass City area within an 8-mile radius. It was just gone. It was just gone. Still, it's kind of fascinating. These fires are going on in some places, small and getting larger. But according to the stories, people went about their business, thrashing grain, plowing fields, headed to town to go to the store, delivering livestock, and the post office. The post people were delivering as well. This is just a regular day. The old timers, though, looked around and they saw the clouds. They felt the dryness and the smoke. They knew that it had happened once before in 1871. And that was the name. In 1871, October 8th was the date that was known simply as the day Michigan burned. But it wasn't the only place that burned. Here's one of the stories that's kind of fascinating. You've probably heard the story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, right? The story goes that Mrs. O'Leary went out to milk her cow in the city of Chicago. And when the cow kicked over her lamp, it started the Great Chicago Fire. Another theory was, and believe it or not, that it was a comet, that a comet had struck Chicago. But it wasn't. And Mrs. O'Leary may have lived there. She may have had a fire. But this was a huge fire that was going. And this is where the fires of 1871 started. It spread across to Kalamazoo and north, and it went north into what's the name? Peshabatown in northern Wisconsin, and came over into the thumb of Michigan and burned 60–80% across the thumb of Michigan. Now, in 1871, they called that a treetop fire because it just burned across the top of any living trees and didn't really consume everything. But that was a problem for 10 years later. As you look at this map here, this was a map that was done by Sergeant Bailey, who came from Bay City to talk about this. Now you look at this and you look at the dark and you think that that is probably where the fires were. No, that's the only place that the fires were not. Otherwise, any place that's open here in this picture of the thumb, anywhere you look, was burned over very badly. There were some amazing stories. I've been reading stories about the fire for years. And, you know, a strong fire creates its own weather. So winds could come up that were caused entirely by the fire. And it might, one town was saved because the fire acted as a backdrop against itself, and it put it out. There were stories about the howling winds. What people remembered most was the howling winds. And they say that there were tornadoes, fire tornadoes, and some gusts of wind that were recorded at 40 to 60 miles an hour. What people heard were explosions. And it was so dry and hot that the trees literally exploded from the moisture that was inside. Big stones exploded for the same reason. Tanks, tanks that might have had some kind of fuel or fire wood, that kind of thing, that blew. According to the Huron Times, on Monday, they reported that a, quote, strange darkness, black as that of midnight, settled on the devoted village of Sand Beach, which, by the way, would later turn into Harbor Beach. I'll tell you why in just a little while. In Richmondville, the postmaster reported that the streetlights were lit, and people had to light lanterns to see. It was so dark and smoky. In Boston, Massachusetts, newspapers reported strange yellowish skies to the west, and smoke and ash were said to have obscured the sun for several hours. In Boston, that's how big these fires were that were happening. There's a story about the great balls of fire, and what they were talking about was, imagine a softball or a basketball size like this, fireballs. They would literally drop out of the sky and bounce like a basketball. And every time it bounced, it would bounce up and it would start another fire every time it's bounced. There's a story about candles in the wind, which people thought was an eerie sight. And what they were, in the 1871 fire, they had burned most of the stumps, but they'd left the center of these kind of like charcoal. So the fire would get so hot, it would start the fire like a candle. And of course, you know how a candle kind of flickers, and it's a steady light, and it flickers kind of like this. And that's what was happening with these stumps. You could see these big, large, candle, almost candle lights throughout the woods. And it was these stumps that were burning, and they would puff on, and poof, they would be off just that quickly. For weeks, sailors along the Great Lakes, along Lake Huron, reported glowing fires along the shore. Foghorns were blaring because the ship captains couldn't see each other through the smoke. Upwards of 7 miles out into the lake. That's how bad it was. Captain Hebner of the city of Concord reported that from the shore at Port Sanilac to Port Austin, all he saw was one sheet of flame. There are also stories about people who are, what they're doing is they're getting out of their houses. These things were bursting into flame. So they're getting out of their houses, and they're going into the middle of their potato fields, cornfields, or jumping in lakes. And they talk about how sometimes they would wake up the next morning and they would see wild animals out in the same field that they were in. Bear, fox, deer. It was almost, as some people said, like there was a truce between people and the wild animals because they were all doing the same thing. Some tales of this great fire, both of the fires actually, talk about how the first warning of the blazes was this rustle that they could hear, a rustle, and what it was animals fleeing for safety. Squirrels, voles, birds, deer, everything racing to get ahead of the fire. Of course, most of them couldn't do it. Fires move pretty fast, but they remembered that sound of these animals. And there's another strange occurrence that happened too. The heat of the flames withered leaves on trees 2 miles away from any sort of fire. And there were stories of people in the fields where they would pull potatoes completely cooked out of the ground and be able to eat them just like that. Survivors were said that they ate corn off the cob, straight from the cob, because it had been roasted right there. And there was stories of a month later how apple trees and some pear trees bloomed again. And nobody quite knows exactly why, but the heat somehow affected them, and they bloomed once again in September. There's a whole bunch of other stories about the fire, but this one tells a lot. This is a very lonely place. It took me a while to find it. This is the Hillside Cemetery. It's really in the middle of nowhere. It's also called Sutherland and Wheatland Cemetery, and it was built on little less than an acre of land after the Great Fire of 1881. Where it is, it's a mile north of Argyle, in the Minden City State Game Area. I mean, literally, it's out in the middle of nowhere. I had to get my uncle to help me go over there and find where this place is because I had read about it. So what happened was a local farmer named John Cole, this was part of his land. And he was a Civil War veteran, but he was a farmer, and he found 6 bodies in a well on this piece of property. And people had dumped into wells and into the lakes and stuff, but when fire comes, it takes oxygen. So what happened was they suffocated. And he buried them on his land, in this plot of land, and planted 3 cherry trees on top of it. Today, those are the 3 cherry trees right there. That he left. They grew together and intertwined. The people that were there were Emma Palmer, who was 52, her daughter, Mary Ann Earhart, who was 24, her husband, Neil Earhart, who was 30, and their children, Clara, age 8, William, age 2, and the youngest, 9 days old. And that's right there is the marker that Mr. Cole left for them right there. There were others that joined them there, but that was the kind of thing that happened all over the thumb in both 1871 and in 1881. There you go. That's a close-up look. Point of Arcs. If you've been to this lighthouse, it's a beautiful lighthouse. And it's there for only one reason. Along with this, the Point of Arcs U.S. Life-Saving Service is because of this man, the keeper of the house, a guy named Andrew Shaw. Mr. Shaw had this was in charge of the whole lighthouse, and when the fire came on, he and his entire staff, the life-saving station, everybody, put all of the burnables that they could get out into the lake. They just set them in the lake, and they started a bucket brigade, and they spent the next day using the bucket brigade to keep the fire out. They keep the fire off of the lighthouse, and he saved the lighthouse. But his farm, less than a mile away, was burned to the ground. But we thank him because we can go and visit his lighthouse even to this day. Bad Axe, right in the center of the thumb. 400 people in Bad Axe survived the horror by staying in the brand new brick courthouse. They had just built this thing. And at 7 o'clock on Tuesday, September 6th, 7 a.m., Charles Thompson reported that it was 110 degrees inside the courthouse. Nobody, if they hadn't had that courthouse, 400 people would have been gone. The fire was said to be between Cairo and Vassar and destroyed much property, according to the Vassar Times. People jumped into the Cass River to stay out of the fire, and they watched the fire as it went over their heads, over the river. And they also, once again, fish were literally cooked in the river. So they ate fish out of the river when they were stuck out there in the middle of nowhere for a couple of days. Among the stories that I've read were about how it was so hot that when people were running from the fire, they would take the clothes off because it was burning them. So literally, you had people running around up there ahead of the fire with no clothes. Of course, nobody was noticing that because they were all running at that same time. The fires in 1871 burned until there was nothing left. It smoldered until, just like in 71, a heavy rain came and put it out. According to this awful toll, in 1881, the big fire, at least 282 people were dead, keeping in mind that there weren't that many people in the thumb at the time. 15,000 were homeless, 3,400 buildings destroyed, and 2,000 square miles burned. That's a lot of land that was gone. Now, here are some connections. This is kind of interesting. The 1881 fire was the first event that was ever responded to by the American Red Cross. It was the first time they ever responded to a disaster anywhere. Clara Barton, this is how it happened. Clara Barton, of course, is the founder of the American Red Cross. And she started her career by nursing wounded soldiers on both sides in the Civil War. And then she went off to Europe to nurse soldiers for the new International Red Cross. This was during the Crimean War. She came home and founded the American Red Cross a month before the fire in 1881. But in order to do what the American Red Cross wanted to do, they had to get congressional approval for the Geneva Convention. You've heard of that, right? So she went to a friend of hers, Senator Omar Conger, who had introduced the bill for her. He helped her because she had nursed his brother, Colonel Conger, during the war, after he was wounded at Spotsylvania. Omar Conger, the senator from Michigan, the senior senator from Michigan, and he was from Port Huron, to be exact. And in the Cass City Library, you can go in there, and they have in a little box, glass box, a vase that was sent by Clara Barton to a local pastor who helped her during that time. Now, they responded, it was the first response. It wasn't the biggest response, but it was their first response to a disaster that they had ever had. So I always found those stories kind of fascinating. Let's talk a little bit now. Oh man, my time is going really fast. So let me hop ahead here because we don't have that much time left. You got to see this though. Here, this is the Tuscola County Courthouse in the middle of Cairo, Michigan. And I was there as a little kid. My grandfather was one of the people that helped build it. And he remembered talking about the great stained glass that was in there. And what this is purportedly showing is Governor Cass making a deal with the local Native Americans to buy canoes that he was going to use on his trip to go to find the source of the Mississippi. Remember, we talked about that a little ways later. I had a friend of mine draw it so you could see a little bit better about what it looked like. And this is supposed to be at the Saginaw River. What do we got here? Okay. I'm going to ask you one of my trivia questions here. Why do some people call Cass City a baseball town? Is it because Abner Doubleday invented baseball at Cass City High? That's A. B, the first baseball stitching company was founded there? Or C, it's the home of 2 members of baseball's Hall of Fame? Well, believe it or not, it is it's the birthplace of 2 members of baseball's Hall of Fame. Larry Leland McPhail and his son Lee they're the only father and son members of the Baseball Hall of Fame today. Larry McPhail from Cass City was general manager of the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. He come up with the idea of night baseball, and he bought the first team plane. His son worked for the Dodgers and the Yankees, was GM for the Baltimore Orioles, American League president from 74 to 84. He led the expansion, including the Toronto Blue Jays, and he negotiated the end of the 1981 strike. By the way, Abner Doubleday did that in New York. You probably know that already in Cooperstown. But there's his son, Larry. It's kind of surprising, out in the middle of nowhere up in Cass City, 2 members of baseball's Hall of Fame. This is the Port Hope chimney. It was part of it was part of the whole thing, a local lumber mill. And it is the only thing that's left from a lumber mill or any kind of industrial event from that time to this day. And it's there in Port Hope. You drive by and off in the middle of nowhere is this big chimney that's over there. It was built in 1858. It's all that remains of the lumber mill, established by William Stafford. Point of Arcs. Point of Arcs actually is literally at the tip of the thumb. And Point of Arcs actually means the point of ships. Doesn't that look like a ship sticking out into the lake right there? That's where that name came from right there. It's a fascinating place. I love it. And you've probably seen pictures of Turnip Rock somewhere. That is right next to the thumb, the thumbnail. That's what they call that, the thumbnail, the last one. The winner of the first Indianapolis 500 was an engineer from Saginaw named Ray Haroon. What was the innovation that helped him win? Was it a windshield? Did he invent the rear view mirror? Or did he remove the extra seat? Well, the answer is he invented the rear view mirror and removed the extra seat. He won the first Indianapolis 500, but at that time they had to have an extra person in the car to watch out behind. And he said, I'm just going to use a rear view mirror. So he invented the rear view mirror. How about that? This is Bob Berman. Bob Berman was a race car driver. And actually, he worked for my great uncle up in Kingston, where he used to race. He was in the first Indianapolis 500, and he was among the first people that were members of the Racing Hall of Fame, all from up there. I'm getting to the end. I've got to. I have to apologize because not watching a clock, I kept on going fast. But I want to talk about this guy right here. Does anybody know who Frank Murphy is? Well, I'll tell you the story because Frank Murphy, I'm doing a newscast. I remember reading a story about, well, it was actually Kwame Kilpatrick and how he had been convicted at the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice in downtown Detroit. And I remember other stories where I kept on hearing, you know, these nasty people were convicted or going to prison at the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice. Well, what did this guy ever do to have himself associated with those people? Well, let me tell you a little bit about Frank Murphy because he's one of the more fascinating people in Michigan that you should know. He's from Harbor Beach, which actually, and I told you earlier, it used to be called Sand Beach, but the people there decided that they didn't want people to think that the only thing there was sand. So they built a man-made harbor. It's the largest man-made water harbor and freshwater lake in the world. Frank Murphy went to law school at U of M, and then he left the Thumb and went down to Detroit. And he became a recorder's court judge, which is how he's dressed here. He later became the mayor of Detroit. And then he was governor of Michigan. He was governor of Michigan during the Great Sit-Down Strike here in Flint in 1936. He called out the National Guard, and the owners all thought he was going to call them out to clear the plants of all the workers that were sitting down. No, he forced them to negotiate, thus ending a real problem for everybody, and there was no there was no violence involved in that. And then Franklin Roosevelt had use for him. He sent him to the Philippines to be the last governor general of the Philippines. The first governor general was William Howard Taft. It gives you an idea of how important this position was. Later, he became FDR's attorney general, Frank Murphy, and then he was appointed to the Supreme Court as an associate justice. Associate Justice Frank Murphy. And he wrote one of the most famous dissents in history. And it was called the Kobayashi versus the U.S. case. And that was the Japanese internment case where it was taken to court. And in his dissent, because the court said that FDR was okay to send American citizens away into these concentration camps, he said he was the first to use the word race in a decision. And he basically said, and this is a fact, that the only thing these people were guilty of was being Japanese. And he said, why aren't we doing this with Germans? Fascinating character, Frank Murphy. How are we doing here? I'm going to take another couple minutes, Phil.
Oh, you're fine. Yeah, we're at the 48-minute mark, but I mean, you know, we've got an hour to play with, so the floor is yours.
There's a couple more stories that I wanted to tell. And so this is one about the White Rock. You see it out there, right? Well, it was on a extended. You see how this is all divided out here? If you look where the line goes out into Lake Huron there off the Thumb, that is exactly where the White Rock is. And the White Rock is written into the Treaty of 1819 and the Treaty of Detroit written in London, just in case you didn't know that. So that White Rock along M25 offshore out there, and there's a little park right by it, was there because of that. Their Garfield Inn is at Port Austin. And I wanted to tell the story about Port Austin, and maybe that's the last thing that I do today. Port Austin actually started out, there's a guy named Austin and another guy named Dwight, and they went up there, and it was a place called, I gotta find my note here. Forgive me just a second here. It was a place called Dwight. Here we go. And all right, it starts with Jonathan Bird. And if you've ever been up to Port Austin, you'll see that there's Bird Creek up there, and Jonathan Bird owned it. He owned all of that, and he sold it to a guy named Smith, Austin, and Dwight, a lumber company up there. Came up there for the lumber, obviously, to make some money. The village was then named Dwight. As the lumber started to play out, Mr. Austin started looking ahead, and he built a dock because he wanted to send out stuff, but he wanted to bring it in as well. And the area became known as Austin's Dock, which I thought was kind of cool. Well, then he realized you can't see my dock when it's dark. So he took a telephone pole, nailed it onto his dock, and put a light on it, and he called it Austin's Lighthouse. Pretty soon people started calling it Austin's Light. Well, as more people started to find his dock day and night, people began to call it Austin's Port. Well, now the area around Austin's Port and the rest of the town was known as Dwight, so they had kind of a problem, but people wanted a post office. So they had to choose a name, and you can't have two different names in the same community. So with the wisdom of Solomon, they split the call. They called it Dwight Township, and they called it Port Austin. And that's how Port Austin got its name. Here's the Huron petroglyphs, which you can see in the middle of the thumb. It's the only place in Michigan where you can actually see Native American art that's left on rocks like that. It was found after the Great Fire of 1881 when all the brush was burned off. Grindstone City. There used to be a mine up there where they did grindstones all the time until literally one day somebody invented something that would replace grindstones. So they literally walked away overnight, and grindstones are now used as patio markers and stuff like that all over the place. Seaboing beer, the last day that they did Seaboing beer, they made empty cans and turned them into fish floats, just in case you didn't know that. Last fun thing here. What did a person from Bay City accomplish? Find the source of the Mississippi River, fly a plane under the Mackinac Bridge, ride a barrel over the Niagara Falls, or win 2 medals of honor? Well, the answer is a barrel over the Niagara Falls. It was actually done by Anna Edson, and she was a dance teacher. Yes, a dance teacher in Bay City. And she decided that she wasn't doing very well, and she needed to find a way to make some money. And she had read about the great World's Fair in New York, and it reminded her of Niagara. And she heard about how other people had gone over, and she thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make my own barrel, and I'm going to go over the falls, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my life telling the story, and I'll make a lot of money. She did. And she made a trip over the falls with her favorite little pillow, and she lived to tell the tale. She was the first that actually lived to tell the tale. However, she hired a manager. Her manager stole her barrel, stole her money, and she spent the rest of her life sitting there by the Niagara Falls getting a nickel to tell her story. So sometimes your plan for retirement doesn't always work. I have to apologize. Like I said, I've got so much to talk about, and sometimes I lose track of how long I'm going. So I'm sorry about it. If there's a question, Phil?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, I'm monitoring the chat and the question and answer feature. So you're welcome to ask a question if you want to. Just to give you time to ask one if you have one. I just wanted to let you know our next program sponsored by or hosted by our North Branch Library is Intro to Telescopes and Stargazing. That's going to be on Thursday, July 30th at 7 p.m. So I hope you all can attend that. Should be a good one. Looks like we don't have any questions. So you covered everything and more. So I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us, Michael.
Let me mention a couple of quick things here.
Yeah.
When I started, I said you can't make up better stories than what really happened. And I hope that some of these stories prove that to you. I'm working on my next book, and it's called Michiganians You Should Know, and Some You Do and Don't Know Why. You can look at any of my books or anything at michaeljthorpe.com. And I will be letting you know that the book actually is a pandemic book, because I've been working on it for a couple of years, but all of a sudden I didn't have anything else to do. So I sat down and started writing, and I got it done in 2.5 months. So yeah, here we go. So
you were much more productive than I was. That's
Thank
awesome.
you very much for inviting me. And hopefully someday, Phil, I can come up and talk in person to people.
Yes, face to face. That would be awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. This program is recorded. So if you had to step away or had any technical issues, we'll hopefully be able to post a link to this on our Facebook page. It'll probably link you to YouTube. But thank you so much, Michael, and have a wonderful rest of the week, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.